It's really good to see everyone today and be with you all. We've been really looking forward to the Empower Kentucky conference all year and are just thrilled that you all have managed to make it all virtual so that we can still come together, because as Estria pointed out, there's a lot of reasons why we need to be coming together in this moment. There's a lot of things that young people can be doing. I also just want to take a second to acknowledge the violence in Louisville over the weekend. It is just every single day when there's something else, it can feel so overwhelming. But what gives me hope, and what I hope can give you hope after this discussion, is just seeing the work that young people are doing, not only around our Commonwealth, but around the country. It really just makes a difference. So just to briefly introduce myself and we can get on to the conversation. My name is Andrew Brennen. I'm an education fellow with National Geographic, where I work to support youth-led movements and organizations all around the world. I'm also the co-founder of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, which at least a few of you are aware of. It's an organization in Kentucky that founded by young people, run by young people, that's dedicated to achieving education justice in our public schools. And I think, the reason why I'm so excited for this discussion is that through my work, both with National Geographic and with the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, I've seen firsthand how young people can challenge norms, confront the status quo, and change policy in ways that are so meaningful. And so I think what we're going to do today is just to hear from this brilliant group of panelists that we've brought together, hear about their advocacy journeys, the work that they have done and are doing, and any advice they have for all of us on how we can be kind of more directly engaging in this work to create more equitable communities. So just a couple of housekeeping things off the top. Throughout this presentation, people will be sharing out resources that they've used or organizations that they're a part of. Write these down, because these are all resources and organizations that you can engage in as well. And we want to make sure that you leave this discussion with some tangible pieces that can be useful for your work. Second, please ask us questions. I will endeavor to get as many questions answered as possible, even if it means cutting down on questions from me. So please ask your questions, and when you do it, why don't you go ahead and mention where you're calling in from, because that'll help us get a sense of where people are coming from around the state, and that I think that would be really awesome. And the last thing, as you're hearing about the just diversity of work that folks on this panel are doing and have done, I want you to be thinking to yourself, how can I change something meaningfully in my community? You're going to hear a lot of different examples of what's possible, but I want you to keep bringing it back to your community and your work, thinking about the issues that you're passionate about, the problems that your communities are facing, and what you can take away from these panelists in terms of how you can be addressing things yourself. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give each of the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. If you could just let us know your names, pronouns, and tell us a little bit about the work that you do. Celia, if it's okay, I'd love to start with you.
Definitely. Thank you, Andrew. So my name is Celia Ziliak. I use she, her pronouns, and I recently graduated from Lafayette High School in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'll be attending Barnard College at Columbia University in the fall. So I focus mostly on anti-carceral sexual violence work, which basically means combating sexual violence without the use of police or prisons. So I've been doing this work for a couple of years now. I created a platform called She Matters, which stands for Sexual Harassment Education Matters. and I did a survey on peer-to-peer sexual harassment in high schools that got over 1,000 responses from across the country. And then I created a report on that, and it is on the She Matters platform. And then in high school, I was involved with several different organizations, including the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, as Andrew mentioned. And I'm currently a student organizer with Know Your Nine, which is a student and survivor-led organization that organizes around Title IX, which is a federal civil law that protects students from sexual harassment, assault, and discrimination based on gender identity and sexuality in schools.
Thank you, Celia. And we're going to get into some of that research that you conducted later on in the panel, because I'd be really interested to hear kind of your motivations there. Kevin, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kevin Short, born in Hyden County, raised in Laurel County. I graduated in 2019. During high school, I was involved with the Kentucky High School Democrats. I was president for a while. And now I work full-time with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth as a community organizer in the Cumberland area, which is Knox, Laurel, Whitley, and Pulaski County. What KFTC does is we engage communities for social justice, things like racial justice, environmental justice, a broad platform of progressive values that we fight for. And our chapters decide which ones they want to do most and which they can engage their communities most with. For instance, in Corbin, Kentucky, which is in Whitley County, the Sun Up Initiative was born, which is a great initiative, which is to combat Corbin's history as a sundown town. In 1919, there was an incident where the Black population was expelled from the city, and the city never acknowledged it. And on the 100th year anniversary, they managed to get a week of diversity from the mayor and also some exhibits in the library discussing the history and trying to move past it while acknowledging it. Also fight for clean water and clean air and all the good stuff.
All the good stuff. And I would love to, you started so young, so I'm gonna want to hear more about your origin story later on in this panel. Kevin's been lobbying the state legislature since he was 15 years old, and I think he has some stories to share with us.
A couple.
Christian, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian Motley. I work as a senior manager of policy and partnerships at a national organization called Strive Together. Strive Together is a part of this national movement working in communities around the country to improve outcomes for young people from cradle to career, with a specific emphasis on closing disparities, racial disparities. In that work, I get the opportunity to work with nonprofit leaders who are bringing together cross-sector partners and spending time, some for the first time, with their state legislators, with their local elected officials, and thinking about what are the system barriers that are holding young people back, and what can we do to bring forward evidence-based solutions, a results orientation in this work to again improve outcomes and close disparities. I got my start way back as a student organizer at Berea College. I'm originally from a little place called Alabaster, Alabama. And I came up and was blessed to be able to go to a place like Berea. But I started, registering voters there. And that became, working on political campaigns. And I worked on every cycle through 2018 when I started running myself. Worked at the U.S. Department of Education, worked for Governor Beshear in his Office of Early Childhood, and worked for my friends at the Kentucky Education Association, again, advocating side to side with educators at the Capitol. Again, many folks meeting their legislator for the first time. And so this work with Strive Together is just kind of a culmination of that, and it's been a beautiful journey. I'm glad to be with you all this afternoon.
And I'm really excited to learn more about kind of Christian's perspective on systems level change, particularly when it comes to policy. As some of you might know, we're going to be heading into a legislative session in January that'll be quite interesting. And so hopefully Christian can give us some insight there. Lakin, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
My name is Lakin Dillingham. I use they, them pronouns. I'm from Barberville, Kentucky. Me and Kevin actually did a lot of organizing together with KFTC. So Corbin and Barberville are right beside each other. But yeah, a lot of my work went hand in hand, working toward a just transition, being from coal communities, and a lot of our family and friends having been affected by the coal industry. And then I've done work. I'm a recent graduate of EKU. I studied criminal justice and police studies. I mainly was researching, working toward decarceration, especially for Eastern Kentucky, because it's just where my heart's at. And moving away from carceral infrastructure and repurposing that. And then setting up mutual aid and housing networks with organizations like Kentucky Student Environmental Coalition. Yeah, I guess that's it. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, but.
Yeah, Lakin, you are very, very involved, so I can understand why it's a long list. Now that everyone has introduced themselves, I just want to underscore, folks that are watching, please ask questions. You have a sense now of the work that everyone does, so please ask questions throughout, and we will answer them throughout. But Lakin, actually, I would like to stick with you for just a second, if that's okay. Frankly, some of the most striking images that we've seen outside of Louisville in response to Breonna Taylor's murder have been some of the visuals and protests that have happened in small towns across Kentucky. And I know that there have been some visuals in your hometown. So I'm just wondering if you could, give us a sense of, was that surprising to you to see people organizing? And what did you think when you saw these visuals coming to your hometown?
Yeah, so I mean, so Corbin had their vigil like the day before or 2 days before. Barberville had theirs, and even then, even when I saw Corbin doing it, it's still like I never would have imagined in 1,000 years that that the community in my hometown was going to also respond in that way. So it was I'd grown up witnessing so many of the things I'm sure everyone on this panel has at some point witnessed, especially in majority white communities. But it comes from like Kevin mentioned, the Sun Up initiative. That came out of work that it was a coalition that was formed from work that say KFTC had been doing. And then it was just these people who wanted to do even more than what KFTC was doing in racial justice. So it was things like that, like the people who have been wanting to do something for a long time but didn't see anything happening. And it kind of gives them a little more gusto to kind of work off of seeing another organization that's bigger doing something at least, and then that gives them empowers them to do what they have been wanting to do for a long time, and that's what Sun Up Initiative was.
And what I think is really powerful about that story, Lakin, is that there might be folks watching that feel as if they're the only one in their community who is looking to work toward, racial justice or social change. And so, what would be your advice to them if they're feeling isolated in terms of finding like-minded people and working together?
I mean, for me, that determination kind of came from the fact that I was queer, and I knew already that like I was othered, so I had no choice but to find something, some people who I could identify with and who weren't just saying like this is the way it is. And that's just a thing. That's the culture, I'm sure, not just from where I'm from, that this is just the way it is. You just kind of have to accept it. Grow up. And so I mean it's a matter of just being stubborn, being completely stubborn and ignoring that, and just being as loud as you can when you can. Sometimes safety is compromised, and it makes it harder. It does. But trust your instincts, and be stubborn.
I think that's great advice. And Christian, you work on these kind of persistent inequalities from a policy perspective, mostly in education. But, as our communities are like continuing to endure these intersecting crises in the form of both systemic racism and also what seems to be a worsening global pandemic, what has been on your mind from a social justice and equity perspective lately?
Yeah, I think, the first is that, there's so many conversations about, so let me affirm, first of all, we are dealing with two pandemics. One, racial injustice. The other is this COVID thing that has kind of rocked our worlds. I remember the conversation that was happening early on was that, it was the public health crisis was revealing so many gaps in our system. And the fact is that many of us knew these things already existed, and we're dealing with them in our daily lives and have been for so long. I do think it's important that these barriers have been highlighted, in the follow-up to, what many of us knew as quarantine and businesses closing and so forth and so on. School districts were stepping up in a different way, providing for food security, for example. And, I think about federal funding and flexibilities that were happening. Congress, I don't know if you all watch Congress, they don't do anything. And so to have 2, 3, 4 bills be passed in the course of a month and change is actually a pretty big deal. Spending upwards of $2 and $3 trillion again on these issues that we brought up. Again, food insecurity, housing insecurity. So there were actions taken at the federal level, actions taken at the state level, and my concern and what I'm hopeful for, try to be optimistic about is, there's so many changes that have come up in the work to stabilize community. And many of the organizations we work with, they do kind of their day-to-day intermediary work, working across partners to support communities. But it takes a shift to do the work to stabilize communities. We can't do work if folks can't eat, if folks don't have housing. Folks that may be considered essential labor if they don't have childcare and that sort of thing. And so my hope is I don't know if I would call them fixes, but the new opportunities that were made available to support youth and families in particular. They can't just be for this moment, this 3-4 month period. We have to think about what are those efforts that we can sustain. We know that folks are dealing with food security and housing security all the time. A few streets back, I live here in Lexington, Kentucky. A few streets back from me, I have the street that has the highest rate of eviction, and it's right across from a school. And I know that as young people are moving from school to school, from neighborhood to neighborhood, that has some impact on in the classroom. That has some impact personally, just in terms of trauma that students may be experiencing. So what is the long-term conversation that we need to have about how to address some of these issues? And so that's really what I'm focused on, and what I hope that folks in Congress and folks in our state house continue to consider moving forward.
And I'm going to stick with you for a second, Christian, but first I just want to honor the fact that there might be people listening who have been doing the work in the past few months to support their communities during this crisis. If any of you that are on this call have been doing something to support your communities amid either the racial justice uprisings or the COVID pandemic, if you could just add in the chat what you've been up to. Would love to get a sense of how people are supporting each other in this moment, and also to kind of maybe crowdsource ideas for other people who are looking to get engaged. But Christian, just to stick with you, you mentioned at the end trying to hold our state house accountable, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what's on your mind going into the legislative session in January, particularly what issues you think there are that young people on this call could get involved with advocating around if they're interested in building more equitable communities.
Yeah, I think, it's important to consider that we were just in a recession, 10 years ago, 10 years and change. And in a state like Kentucky, we still, we were experiencing deep, I don't know if you noticed, like when we have a conversation about the state budget, every time it comes around, the discussion is never about dreaming big and thinking about what we can do better, bigger and better to support our people. It's about what can we cut the least, knowing that the cuts are coming. My concern is that we know that the conversation is going to be, what do we have to cut? On the national scale, I've watched states finally coming out of the worst of the Great Recession, and some states beginning to see surplus. Some starting to make more investments in education. Texas made a huge investment last year in P to 12 education at the I believe it was $6.5 billion. They hadn't made an investment in Texas education without action from the courts in about 3 decades. And in Utah, they're building out early childhood infrastructure. They are a state that maybe 5 years ago wasn't making any state investments in early childhood, and I would even, they don't have things like full day kindergarten and that kind of thing. They started to make increases in funding over the last 5 years, and one example is, I think in the session earlier this year, $10 million for what they call optional kindergarten, expanded optional kindergarten, and a little bit more for early childhood. Then they called a special session in May or June and clawed back a lot of that funding because they had to reevaluate where their state budget was. In Kentucky, we are still one of the worst funded, worst states in terms of how we fund education. I don't care what anybody tells you. We are, I think, certainly in the bottom 10 states and maybe lower. And I think that we have got to be prepared to go into the next budget session, making sure that, the commitments that we have made to young people, the commitments that we have made to low-income family and folks of color, that we don't claw those priorities back, that we don't claw back those dollars. Many folks talk about the budget as a moral document. I think that's true. It also is a very real thing, and dollars and cents matter on the ground for families in this state and across this state. And so my hope, I don't want to say I'm singularly focused on that, but what I know is we have already been in the hole in terms of how we fund education priorities. We had a previous governor that, wouldn't even fund textbooks, right? I am concerned about what this next conversation, this budget will look like. And so it's going to take the voices of all of us to ensure that we don't walk back.
Absolutely. I really like the phrase that you used, talking about our budget as a moral document. Really, to me, what that says is in order to have an equitable budget, we need the moral imagination that young people can bring to the table, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that everyone on this call is engaged, is informed, is paying attention. I just want to call out in the chat some folks who have done some amazing actions. Melanie making posters for Black Lives Matter. Ella trying to start her own Black student union. I think that's a great step. Jay focusing on bringing water, first aid supplies to protesters. Logan trying to combat ignorance, which I think is super relevant, both from a racial justice perspective and from a pandemic perspective. So thank you, Logan, and all the rest of you for the work that you're doing. I want to stick with the State House conversation for a second and move to Kevin. Kevin, you've been advocating at the state legislature since you were 15 years old. And first of all, I'm interested, like, how is a 15-year-old received when they are going to the state legislature? But also for those that are watching, what advice do you have for them when they might be around that age, thinking that, going to the state legislature isn't for them or because they're not old enough?
Well, my first piece of advice would be, if you have read anything about the subject you'll be discussing with your legislator, you probably know more than they do. Yeah. People tend to think people in elected positions magically get smarter. They don't. I remember I was 15. It was the first time I've lobbied. It was for a net metering bill. I won't go into all of it because it's kind of dense, but basically it was an anti-solar bill that I was lobbying against with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth as a 15-year-old. And I walked into my legislator's office and he only wanted to speak to me because I was his constituent. But when I brought up solar power, he instead told me that he had an ice cream van that went around his district and gave out free ice cream, and that me and my girlfriend could go and get some if I'd like. Didn't have a girlfriend. I had a boyfriend at the time, so a little extra layer of weird. Yeah, it was interesting, but a few years later, after I got on staff, I actually met with that same legislator, and he agreed to vote against a GOP bill, and which was great, but definitely my advice would be confident, and they will probably say some condescending things, but just stand your ground and know that your knowledge is true and valid. Because I've also had Robert Goforth, for instance, disagree about some basic facts about bills, and when I showed excerpts from the ACLU, it was just said that's not true. So be confident in your knowledge, be confident in your resources, and just because they are elected does not mean they are smarter than you, and they'd probably not be.
Yeah, do your research, be confident in your research, but then the piece that you also said that I think is super important, especially in Kentucky, is that, like, don't burn the bridge just because you have a bad interaction. Some of these legislators are going to be there for a long time. And if you have one bad interaction and that means that you can't go back to their office again, that's going to hurt your ability to advocate effectively on behalf of your communities. So don't burn the bridge where possible. And like Kevin said, maybe that means 2 years from then you'll be able to go back and they'll be with you on an issue. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about what it means to lobby the legislature. Kevin, your work right now with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is super interesting, and I think people on this call maybe have heard of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, but maybe don't know exactly what it is you all do. So if you could just talk a little bit about that briefly, that would be really great.
Yeah, I think we're about 38 years old. It started when some community members didn't like that their water and air were being polluted by mining. It started in Eastern Kentucky. In fact, Lakin had the job I have now when I was a member, and it's kind of funny. But what we do is, sorry, lost my train of thought. Could you repeat the question real quick?
You just what Kentucky's for the Commonwealth does.
Gotcha. I mentioned Lakin and so, clean water, clean air. We try to build community power. We focus on elections a lot. Electoral work is, of course, important. And oftentimes our chapters have offshoots where we get more directly involved without advocating for a single person running for office. The Sun Up Initiative is a good example of that. And a lot of our membership has been involved with organizing the protests. Lisa Garrison is in Corbin, Kentucky, who helped organize the vigil. Ironically, considering what I just said, also running for city commission. So we tried to build not only like positive momentum, but sustainable power too. We interact with the institutions of a city, but no, we cannot rely on them for everything we need. Having a good relationship with the mayor in Corbin, which we do, is fantastic for things like getting a week of diversity. But combating systemic ignorance and racism is something that, well, you have to interact with the community itself more. So working in and out of the systems of power and the institutions of power is kind of the line we walk.
That's a great, I think, reminder for folks that there's different entryways to be making change, and there's like the formal institutions and formal structures, but there's also those informal systems that are around you, and anything within your sphere of influence presents an opportunity to fight for equity. So it's something important to remember. Folks that are watching, please submit some questions if you have them. We'd love to answer them. Maybe you can stump some of these folks on the panel with some super specific question, who knows. But in the meantime, Celia, I want to come to you. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception out there about how young people can make change. I think that from maybe a lot of, at least adult perspectives, that young people are really only protesting. But what I think is really powerful about your work and the research that you've done through She Matters is that it kind of presents this opportunity for young people to be leading research that can help to define and frame issues. So could you just tell us a little bit more about the She Matters research? What prompted you to develop the survey and why you think youth-led research is so important?
Definitely, thank you. So I started kind of forming the idea in my sophomore year of high school after I had a really bad experience with sexual harassment and ended up reporting it. And the reporting process just did not go well. And it ended up taking many months. And then I noticed that a lot of my friends were dealing with the exact same issues. They were experiencing sexual harassment, but no one was really talking about it. None of the adults around seemed to be recognizing that it was happening. And then whenever I would try to talk to adults about it and say like, hey, this is a really big issue that a lot of people are facing, they just kind of brushed it off and said, yeah, like you're just kids, you don't know anything yet. But it's not okay to infantilize youth because we are sentient beings. We know what we're doing. We can have thought processes and we are competent. And so I think it's good to kind of frame this in that sense where we were constantly being told that you can't do this because you're too young, you don't have experience, you're not smart enough, all that kind of stuff. And that's really not true. Anyone can do any of this work. It's just about getting your foot in the door and then continuing and persisting. And so I started this originally. I had a plan that to raise awareness to the fact that this was going on, I was going to do some research and I was going to show that this is a real problem. And so initially I was going to do it in the school system with approval from the administrators, and I was going to work with them to kind of do this survey and show the problems that students were facing. However, after a couple months, it ended up falling through. The administration didn't want to work with me anymore. And so that was a really big challenge for me, is whenever you come up against this roadblock and you're not sure how to move forward because you've now been shut down and told this isn't going to happen anymore. But I knew I didn't want to just stop. I wanted to do this research. I thought it was important that we had something like this out there. And so I decided to work with the Student Voice team in partnership with them, and we did it outside of the school system. We ended up distributing the survey online through social media. We got it in an article to spread it some more. And we ended up getting over 1,000 responses, which we initially had thought it was going to be a lot smaller. Usually this kind of research that is done by actual researchers only gets like 200 respondents. So the fact that we got it that high in a situation where it was not done by professional researchers is really important, and shows the power of being youth-led, because we know where people are. We know how to find people. We know what people's experiences are. And youth are the best experts in their own lived experiences. And so I think it's really important that we have more youth-led research and youth-led organizations, because we can connect with our peers because we experience it as well. So that is basically what I've been doing, and I've been continuing to do that kind of youth-led work with Know Your Nine, in both doing inside organizing and outside organizing. Like Kevin said, you know, it's a good balance of both. And I just think it's really important that youth know that their voice is incredibly important, and whenever they can use it to shine light on something that's happening that adults don't always see, it can be really powerful.
And Celia, how were the results of your research received by adults?
Well, it's very interesting you ask. So I ended up getting published in several major news magazines, including Ms. Magazine and Teen Vogue. And it was also in the local Herald Leader here in Lexington. And in fact, my principal was used in a quote for the article, and he said how proud of me he was, and how he had always supported my work, and I think that's a common theme with youth organizers, is whenever it's then publicized, a lot of times adults want to take some sort of responsibility or say that they had a part in it, when really they were just a hindrance in the process. So it was definitely interesting to see. I have a great relationship with him, great guy, but it was really a process of seeing like, okay, yes, I can see that this is going to be a little bit misconstrued of what it was. However, it did get out there, and it ended up impacting a lot of people, which was really cool to see, because then I would get messages from people saying, hey, I've had this kind of experience. It really was great to see that you did this work and you got it out there, and that so many other people have also had experiences like me.
Yeah, and I think one of the important lessons from your story, Celia, is that, you know, when youth are leading the research, it's a transfer of power. It is you young people taking power into their own hands to define the problems that they are facing. And that power has to come from somewhere. And usually it's coming from adults in positions of power. And so when that happens, adults can feel a little anxiety, but that's okay, as long as you're determined with the work that you want to do. And then also you remember that piece that Kevin pointed out, the importance of trying to maintain relationships, even if things are rocky at the beginning. I did just want to stick with you, Celia, because there was a question in the chat from Logan Peters. How did you get backing other supporters, et cetera, for She Matters? Who specifically were they? And Logan specifically worried about being othered by pursuing that kind of work. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all about finding your community of people. And I think it's also important to note that it doesn't have to be in your specific community. Sometimes you can find people across the country from you that can really be great supporters. So with Know Your Nine, we are all spread out across the country, and we communicate entirely online, and they are one of the biggest supporters for me, and I support their work as well. And it's just a great way to connect with other activists across the country and see what work they're doing where they are and learn from them. I've learned so much from that organization and have been able to grow a lot because I just kind of put my foot in the door and was like, hey, this looks like an interesting opportunity. I'm gonna just apply to it. And then I happened to get in, and then it has become this great group. And another way for She Matters specifically is with the student voice team, which I would highly encourage everyone to look into because it is Kentucky based. So you can easily join, and it's all self-selected, so it's not like an application process or anything like that. And they have been amazing supporters in doing my research, and they kind of created this really big base that allowed me to get my message out, and they helped to push the survey out and then push the results out after I finished.
Awesome. So thinking creatively about the different allies that are out there, and also leveraging social media where possible to connect with people that may not be in your geographic area, but who are doing similar work. We have a lot of questions in the chat now, so I'm just gonna maybe move to some of those, and anyone can answer them. So let's just try and get through as many as we can. Bobby says that he's president of his school's student Y chapter, which is the YMCA Youth in Government programs, the KYA Kuna programs that are mock legislator programs, whose mission revolves around servant leadership. How should we choose organizations to partner with so that we can serve on a deeper level than one weekend? So, how can Bobby identify ways to bring the lessons that they're learning at these YMCA programs back to their communities? Lakin, Kevin, I don't know if maybe you can speak to at all, like how you first found these organizations that you ended up working with, Kevin, in your instance, Kentucky High School Democrats, and Lakin, in your instance, of course, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. How did you first kind of get involved with them? Like tactically, like what should young people do to do that?
For the Kentucky High School Democrats, I was already progressively minded, so I was Googling Kentucky Democrat ? Looking for absolutely anything and everything. And I found a couple of orgs, Kentucky Young Democrats first, and then KFTC. Not the way I would recommend going about it, because it's very just on the front page. But when it comes to building power in your communities, I would, using Kentucky High School Democrats for an example, amazing org to get involved in, and an amazing place to really solidify your viewpoints and your leadership skills. However, it's the people you're working with that are more important. KFTC, for instance, sometimes memberships have offshoot initiatives that KFTC tries to support, but no longer is the key person on. So I think when you do end up finding these groups to partner with, building the community inside of it, not necessarily the membership numbers, something to keep in mind.
So all about relationships. Lakin, what would you add?
Yeah, I was gonna go off of that. Literally, it's kind of it's literally trying to look into relational organizing with other people. So when you go to those events that are very short-lived. Pick up on the people around you who are, who you have maybe some particularly interesting conversations with, who maybe talk about the same things or share the same type of concerns. Just have the conversation simply that, hey, I want to do something that, goes beyond just this weekend with some people, and you'll be surprised at how many of them are like, yeah, I would love to do that. It seems like such a big thing, but like so many times there other people are thinking the same thing, they just don't know how to put it out there.
Very similar to me and you, Lakin, I think. Yeah, before we decided to get the same haircut. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
But that is pretty similar to how me and you started to becoming good friends. I think we started talking about specific issues, and I think now that you're one of like the closest people I've met in this sphere. So relational organizing, not only good for organizing, but great for friendships.
Yes. Okay, so many questions now in the chat. Ebony asks, was there ever a time you wanted to give up? And if so, what made you keep going? I want to direct that question toward Christian, because I know, Christian, this is not the first time you've run for office. The first time you did run for office, there's a little bit of machinations, and I'll leave it to you to share that story. But what makes you keep going when you're facing these obstacles?
Yeah, so Andrew speaks of a time so far ago. It feels 2018 I ran for city council for the first time in Lexington, Kentucky. I happen to be running for city council again in 2020, and suffice it to say, I was running against an incumbent. Incumbent didn't like that all that much, and so found some means to have me pushed off the ballot. And it's the kind of normal things that you hear. This is a guy who's been around since I was in second grade. And since I was in second grade, he's probably pushed back on every opportunity we've had as a city to advance our city. Fairness ordinance. Lexington had one of the strongest in the state at the time that it was passed. He voted against that. We tried to raise the minimum wage a few years ago. He voted against that. He's got this line out there about our district. I live in District 8 in Lexington. He says, our public safety is an issue in our district because our district is so diverse. That's just a strange thing to say. He said that to a journalist at the Herald Leader, and I don't think it aged well either. So that's the kind of thing that I was up against. There's a guy named Reverend William Barber who is a powerful force out of North Carolina. And I heard him giving a sermon one time or a talk, and he said, you know how strong you are by the way they fight you. And so for me, that instance just spoke to how important that this work is. And for me, it actually, doesn't matter all that much for me whether I'm at the horseshoe or not. I will continue to do this work no matter what. I do think there are important system and policy levers that the council hold. And that's why I'm running for office. But for me, it's the work, it's the product that we're able to create, and I will continue to work on that no matter what. And so there have been times, yes, when I was running in 2018, I felt a lot of frustration with that process, right? I shed a lot of tears, 2014, 2016, going back to 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed. It is, when you are engaged in something that you care so much about, let alone when it's something that connects so much to your life and your background. I grew up in a place, the neighborhood was literally called the Bottom, and we didn't have everything that we wanted in life, right? I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you all if it hadn't been for just special people who were placed in my life along the way. And being able to go to a place like Berea College. But I take it personal when I hear someone talk about diverse populations in our community, because I know what it feels like to be the other. I take it personal when you talk about low income folks, or I happen to be from a rural community in Alabama. You want to say something about country folks, I take it personal. And so I feel great pain a lot of times, but I focus on what would take that pain away. And it is the idea that young people and families have all the support that they need. It is that folks going back and forth to Taste Creek High School over here have safe routes to and from school. And you don't feel like because you live on one street or another, you are of any less value. And so that is what pushes me to continue doing that work, because I got to do the work to make sure that nobody else feels that pain.
And I think it's also a reminder that so many of these issues that we're talking about are issues of life and death. And so when you're motivated by something as core to humanity as life itself, I think that can be a really powerful motivator. If Alexandra or Astrid could give me a signal on how much time we have left, I think we can do one more question. While I'm asking this question, if folks on the panel want to drop their handles in the chat so that people can stay in touch with them and follow up with you if they have additional questions. We're not going to be able to get to every question in the chat today, unfortunately, but you are all active and doing this work on social media, so I would love for folks to be able to stay connected with you. But for the last question from Aspen, they asked, do you have any suggestions for not being downplayed when you share experiences of what you're speaking out about? For example, saying you're queer and it has led you to speaking out for LGBTQ+ issues. Does anyone have advice for them?
I think part of it, because I experience this a lot, saying like, I am a survivor and I also do survivor work. A lot of times people are then like, oh, so that's why you do it, because you've experienced it. And I think it's important to know that like your experiences as a person are really valid, and it makes sense that then you want to do something about it, because once something has affected you personally, you have a unique perspective that you can share because it has happened to you, you know what it's like, and then you can help other people see that perspective, change people's minds and that kind of stuff. So I think it's just owning your truth and knowing that some people are just going to say stuff that is hurtful because they want to be hurtful. And I think it's important to just remember that you are who you are for a reason, and your experiences are valid, and who you are as a person is valid, and what you speak up about is completely valid, no matter where you're coming from.
Lakin, did you want to add to that as well? I saw you had looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah, so there just like Celia said, a lot of recognizing your own power, but also there's a point where you have to recognize also that that's going to happen because of the world we do live in, and so that's why that is so important to make sure you know your own power. It's just recognizing that these are the systems we are working against. Sometimes you will be downplayed, and you have to remember that for yourself, that them downplaying you says nothing about your work.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone. Christian, Kevin, Lakin, Celia, you all just provided such a rich discussion, so many different pieces of advice, different resources. If there's any other resources that you didn't get to share, I would love it if you could just drop them in the chat so that folks can have the benefit of your knowledge. But with that, I'm gonna pass it back off to Alexandra. Well, actually, the last thing I want to say is also thank you to everyone that's watching. You all are doing such amazing work, even by being in this space. And I just want you to know that if we are ever going to solve any of the issues that the panelists talked about today, it requires the passion and the energy and the urgency that you as young people can bring to the table. So we need your voice. And I just want to say, as a Kentuckian, as someone who wants to see our Commonwealth move into the future in a beautiful way, thank you for your dedication to this work. But so with that, I will pass it back off to Alexandra.